People don't talk about William Somerset Maugham very often these days, which is a great shame. He's one of the greatest writers I think that ever lived. And that is, of course, my opinion. But one of the questions that's fascinated me since I first discovered him as a writer was, when did Maugham become Maugham? And in this video, in which I talk about The Hero by W. Somerset Maugham, I'm going to try and answer that question at least a little bit. With Closely Observed Literature, I'm Christopher Walker. I'm one for the strained metaphor. So here I am at the top of one of the steepest paths in Bielsko. It stretches off down below all the way to the train line that has kind of fallen out of use somewhat in recent years, and then goes all the way back up on the other side of that hill to reach basically the same point where I am now. So in other words, I'm going to work very, very hard going all that way to basically finish where I started, more or less. But that's my strained metaphor for you. It probably doesn't work as well as I'd like to think that it does. But it does serve as a handy introduction to the book The Hero by Somerset Maugham. I got hold of this copy through Project Gutenberg because now the copyright has elapsed. I think it has done for a while. It's easy to get a free digital copy, so I read it on my Kindle. That's why I don't have a paperback version to show to you. So what is The Hero about? Well, it's a book that was written in 1901 when the Boer War in South Africa was still on everybody's minds. Jamie Parsons is returning to his little town in Kent, a hero. He's won the Victoria Cross for what he did during the Boer conflict. He rushed to the aid of a fellow soldierman who'd been struck with a bullet and pulled him to apparent safety. Or at least he tried. Whilst heaving the body up, the soldier was struck a second time, this time a fatal blow. But still, for the attempted rescue, he was awarded one of the country's highest military honours. But he feels like a fraud. He's come back a changed man, no longer the innocent youth who had departed for India and then for South Africa. Now he is a much more jaded character, which is true to the Maugham type. He doesn't think that he's a hero. He thinks that if he'd just left his fellow serviceman to his fate, he would have been taken as a prisoner of war, treated by field medics, and would probably be alive today. He thinks that the act that won him the Victoria Cross cost his friend his life. He feels enormous guilt about that. Hello, dog. He feels guilty about other things as well. For example, the fact that he's engaged to young Mary Clibborn, a local do-gooder who was happy enough to get engaged to him before he went off on his travels and to war. And he said she didn't mind a long engagement because she knew that his Christian heart was in the right place. Well, now that he's back in town, all eyes are upon him. Is he going to go through with his pledge? Is he going to marry Mary? Well, again, he's a different man. Before he left, the world of sex and intrigue was all alien to him. But on his time away, he discovered the joys and thrills of true romantic love. One that was spurned, of course, because that's Somerset Maugham's way. You can't have things go right for anyone, really, can you? But now he looks at Mary with distaste. Almost as a closeted homosexual man might look at a woman that he's promised to sleep with. Interesting, that, isn't it? So the novel's great conundrum is, what will Jamie Parsons do? Now, when Somerset Maugham wrote this book, we were still in that period of literary history, I suppose, but coming to the tail end of it, in which all books were expected to end with either a death or a marriage. If you've seen the most recent film adaptation of Little Women, you'll know that that was the prevailing attitude, and that film version does a fantastic job of turning the concept on its head and mocking it. But Somerset Maugham was not so far in advance of his time that he could do that himself. So, spoiler alert, come the end of the book, Jamie Parsons decides that he will marry this woman, or at least tell people he will, and then arrange for an accident that leads to his shocking demise. Not so shocking. This for me was the weakest part of the book, but I suppose it worked in its way, and it also lent a secondary meaning to the title, The Hero. For you see, when Jamie earlier in the book had spurned Mary's advances and said that he couldn't go through with the engagement, up stepped the local rector looking for a young wife, not particularly worrying if she's attractive or not, and he said he would be happy to take Jamie's place. Mary said, no, it's Jamie or no one for me, I'm afraid. And of course that decision would have dire repercussions. But come the end of the story, Jamie's dying breath, he says to Mary, marry that guy, whatever his name is. Do it for me. So she does. And he, the rector, I think he's a rector, he could be seen as being the hero of the story after all, because he does what is right by Mary out of the goodness of his Christian heart. So we could say, hello dogs, nice to see you. I don't know why you're barking, I'm only talking about Somerset Maugham. Somerset Maugham would have loved you, I'm sure. So at the end of the story we have our hero, and it's not Jamie Parsons as you might have expected. So, what do we think of this story? Well, some people have said that it's a little bit drawn out, that it's a little bit wishy-washy, a little bit boring, a little bit unrefined in its scathing assessment of British society of the time. I've read a lot of reviews that say similar things. This is the old train line, there's nothing coming as far as I can tell. I don't think I've seen a train on here for a long, long time. There's a burnt out car over there, of course. People have had lots of negative things to say about this book, but for something that was basically Maugham's sophomore effort, I think it stands the test of time very well. It's as readable now as it would have been when it was written. A lot of the impact, I suppose, has been lost over the years because it's a lot harder to shock us in the 21st century, especially compared to 1901 when the book came out. And it was one of two books that Somerset Maugham wrote around the same time that dealt with similar issues but from different perspectives. The other, of course, being the superior Mrs. Craddock, which is one of the best attempts that Maugham had at writing a convincing female character, and certainly the only one that springs to mind where the female character was actually the lead of the story. What really interests me, though, is this emergence of the Maugham style, almost fully realised, and a lot of the central motifs of the Maugham style already present as early as 1901. You see, I came at Maugham the wrong way. That's not a sex joke. I first stumbled across one of his books back in 2003 during one of the greatest little adventures of my life. I had the Interrail pass and I was, gallivanting around Europe. I'd run out of books to read when I reached Vienna, and I went into this dusty old second-hand bookshop, asked the kindly Austrian there where their English section was, and he pointed me to a dim corner. And one of the almost junked paperbacks I found there was The Razor's Edge. And it's that lovely cover with a kind of artistic drawing on the front, a print or something, of a guy with his foot up on a chair romancing some young woman. I have no idea how it relates to the story at all, but it seemed fitting at the time. And that book must have been there for quite some time, because this being in 2003, you would not have expected to see the price inside listed in pfennigs. Or maybe you would, I don't know. So I read it and I loved it, and I loved it because there's so much about Larry Darrell that seemed to be me, searching for meaning in life, wondering where to go. But if you've read The Razor's Edge, you'll know that though it does end with a death rather than a marriage, it's not the death of Larry Darrell as you might expect, but instead he rides off into the sunset, kind of like Shane in the classic Western. You don't know what's going to happen next to him. And it's really a much more modern ending than Maugham tended to write, because he stuck with this idea of the death or the wedding for quite a lot of his writing history. And then after I'd read The Razor's Edge and fallen head over heels in love with Maugham as a writer, I thought, well, I want to read everything he's ever written then. And a little while later, I read Liza of Lambeth, and I was disappointed because it didn't have that spark, that wit. And there was only one bit of Liza of Lambeth that I really liked, and that was a bit of scene setting near the start of the book, where he said that the people of this little area of London, down at heel area, all of these guys were sitting disconsolate as poets. I like those 3 words. But in terms of the writing and what I'd come to expect of Somerset Maugham as a writer, the only time that I saw anything like what I expected was towards the end of the book, where Liza is going through a very bad pregnancy and delivery. Maugham himself worked as a midwife, I think. He did the rounds for a while during his medical studies. And of course there we have the death that ends the book. But the camera pans back for a moment and it shows the people waiting in the room next door. And they'd grown so used to this sort of tragedy that it was the sort of tragedy that you could talk about over a cup of tea whilst it was unfolding. And just for that brief moment, a couple of paragraphs, I saw the spark. But something must have happened to Maugham between writing Liza of Lambeth and writing Mrs. Craddock and the hero that really changed him as a writer. He gave up the mock social realism, the dialectical rendering of the speech patterns of Liza of Lambeth. Don't get me started on that. It's as bad as John Buchan in the 39 Steps. Worse, actually. And he went for this jaded, cynical approach, and he returned to the same themes. The theme of the young man unsure of his life and of his destiny, who's desperate to find a way through, one that does not lead at the end of the book to death or marriage. And I think it took Somerset Maugham something like 45 years to really accomplish it. He changed his own life story to fit this pattern with human bondage. And later, when he wrote on The Razor's Edge, he avoided that death and marriage scenario by shifting it onto somebody else. It's still there a little bit, but not as much as it could have been. So we should be thankful for that. It's not to say The Razor's Edge is a perfect book by any means. There's still quite a lot about it that I don't like, and I think I've talked about that elsewhere. But I love Maugham. And you do wonder how much real life played a role. I read the excellent biography by Selina Hastings of Somerset Maugham some time ago. It's another review here on this channel. And she talked about his ill-fated marriage to Ciri Maugham. And that's a name I came across recently in quite another context. I was reading a short book on the Mackintosh style and Charles Rennie Mackintosh, the architect and designer and artist from Scotland. That was very interesting, but Ciri Maugham was mentioned because she too was a noted interior decorator in her time. But she didn't make a very good marriage with Maugham, and no one could expect her to have done that. Maugham was homosexual. And I think that's at the root of a lot of these stories. The power there is a displacement of sorts. Maugham wanted to escape his own destiny, but literature only provided death and marriage as possible outcomes for him. The marriage one came first, but that wasn't the end of it. And I suppose things only ended with his death much later. But by then he'd achieved a sort of freedom, and I think he understood that, which is why we have that sort of freedom achieved in books like The Razor's Edge, but not in The Hero. But I tell you one thing, the ending of The Hero really hit me hard, because for a moment I let myself believe that Jamie Parsons was going to say no to Mary Clibborn, and he was going to walk away from all of that, and he was going to lead the life he wanted, going out into the world and exploring, seeing things and meeting people. And that's why I didn't like the ending. Not because it was a bad ending, but because it ended badly. And I think that's part of the fascination for me with Somerset Maugham. I don't want to see it end that way. I want the story to go on. Don't we all? And with that, almost as if I timed it to perfection. Actually, I've just keep talking and talking until I got to the top of the hill. That's why I'm out of breath. Here we are at the end of my metaphor. And I'm back where I started, just much further away. And with that, I thank you for your attention. And I bid you adieu until next time. Keep reading.